Hi, Dave here. I just wanted to talk to you guys about just some things that I think would be very, very important right now. We're seeing a number of situations come through our office, and we're addressing a number of situations in our supervision and in our counseling that I think is just very applicable. And it's revolving around or talking about the grieving process. And I kind of wanted to address some things that might not be something that we would consider. So if you think of the grieving process, almost immediately, where do our minds go? Our minds have a tendency to go to the loss of a loved one, or the death of someone that we know, or an experience that we handled revolved around grief and death and dying. I want to present the fact that grief affects us all in many different ways, and I'm finding more and more that it's a lot more prevalent than maybe what we realize. So consider the fact that we might be going through a grieving process. Let's say if a friend moves away, or if we graduate and we're not used to not being in our element that we've been into for a long time, or let's say that maybe there's a house fire and we lose something that is dear to us, or a divorce where our family is no longer what it has been. And so grief can affect us in many different ways, and it will affect us, if it hasn't already, in one way or another. Definitely it affects all of us. It touches all of us in one way or another. And I just wanted to throw some thoughts out that might help us in considering how to work through this grieving process. So in the 60s, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wrote a book on what she called the 5 stages of grief. And in those stages, first off, she identified the first stage as denial and isolation, followed by the anger stage, and third was a bargaining stage, and fourth was depression, and then finally the fifth and final stage was acceptance in the grief process. And I want to identify the fact that lots of times those stages can affect us in one way or another in different ways. However, it's not like an order that we go through. It might be a random this and a random that, and we might go through those stages and feel like we're finally at an acceptance stage, and then something triggers that in a way that's maybe different than what we thought it might be. And so it can be reoccurring, and it can be random and different. One thing to note also is, as we're going through a grieving stage as a family, or as friends, or as we're going through a grieving stage as a community, that different people at different times are in different stages of that. I had a fellow come in a while back that he was talking about how upset he was at one of his siblings in particular, who seemed to just be happy and okay with how things are, when he was frustrated and upset, and possibly even in that depression stage of things, and he couldn't figure out how this sibling was content and okay. And we kind of identified and went through the fact that this sibling was probably actually in the denial stage of things. And doesn't necessarily mean that that's wrong. It means that this individual is in a different stage of how they're working through and processing what's going on. So we want to be mindful of the different stages of stuff. One thing to also recognize, if we're helping an individual, or if we're, maybe a child or friends or loved ones or people that we're around work through something, that we spend more time understanding and helping them understand where they're at, and less time telling them how and when and why they need to deal with things in a certain way. I was at a funeral a while back, and there was a little young child grieving the loss of her grandmother. And during this process, it was interesting to me because I watched one of the adults come in and was talking to the child in an effort to help them feel better, and indicated, "Don't cry. Grandma's in a healthier, happier, better place." Now, given the circumstance, I can't say that I disagreed with that statement. But I don't know that it necessarily helped that child feel any better, because she's looking around seeing everybody else crying and hurting and frustrated, and I'm being told to be happy and that it's okay. Well, the reality of it is that it's appropriate it was appropriate for that child to be in that stage where they were at. Maybe a healthier, more appropriate way would be to ask questions and understand their meaning or their understanding of where things are. And I think we gather incredible, valuable insight when we take time to ask those questions. and take time to recognize and help them recognize. Maybe a question might be, it looks like you're really upset at so-and-so. How come? What's going on there? And so as they process and recognize that they're in that anger stage, that becomes easier to work through. Our natural reaction if somebody's angry and upset at us is to be reactive and maybe put them in their place or tell them not be a jerk or not be mad or upset. And people can get stuck in that stage really because they don't recognize or know that they're in it. So just something to consider. One thing that I want to identify is if there's a traumatic event that's happened that our minds are not used to or that we have never experienced before. See, our minds are made to just try to make sense of things, right? To connect A and B and make sense. And if we're experiencing something that we've never experienced before, there's a tendency for our minds to be scattered and go in different directions that might seem kind of wild and crazy. I had a fellow that I talked to a while back that came in. He says, I'm thinking things that I can't even believe I'm thinking. It's just not where I'm at. And then finally it settled in and he was able to work through it as the mind kind of unscrambled and got to a healthier, safer place with that. So not uncommon to experience irrational thoughts or even irrational behaviors in some way as we're going through something that might be traumatic. So one thing to identify and a help that, counseling or an experienced loved one or somebody that can help through that process would be to help us identify those stages of grief and where we're at in that. Keep in mind that those stages, coping with that grief, it's a deeply personal, individual thing. And we all experience that in our own way and in a different way. And most of the time, it's not wrong. It's just different from where we might be thinking or experiencing. So as you go through that, consider those thoughts. If you get stuck in things or unsure of that, definitely I would advise to not be afraid to seek help. We have counselors on board that are experienced in being able to help people through the grieving process, as I'm sure other places do as well. And so the important thing is to work through that in a way that's healthy and good. Don't resist those stages. I'm not saying to embrace that because that almost seems the opposite, but we've got to learn to maybe figure out a way to engage in those different stages and recognize it and work through that, because if not, then it prolongs that grief and creates a scenario where we might get stuck in one of those stages and not be able to work through in a way to find that acceptance stage that we ultimately hope to get to.